All aboard! Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls from all fans of all ages, I am Beast Mike, and you've now arrived at my train of thought. It's also time to ask the question, where do we go from here? Today, we focus on two teams that are kind of sort of intertwined with how they do business and how their seasons have kind of gone. Both were middling and mediocre, but they got there in different ways. Let's talk about the Jaguars and the Saints, who are, I would say, kind of sort of intertwined with the collegiate schools they aren't too far from. For the Saints, obviously LSU. For the Jaguars, you could argue Florida, but I'm going to take the Florida State approach because they played LSU back-to-back years. And they actually beat LSU back-to-back years. And it makes sense because the Jaguars and Saints played each other, and the Jaguars did beat New Orleans in New Orleans. So we'll go Florida teams 3, Louisiana teams nothing in this situation. Nevertheless, the Saints are going to go first in this situation. The Saints are a weird team to think about. Yeah, they went 9-8. Yes, they beat the teams for the most part that they're supposed to, and they lost to the teams for the most part that they're supposed to. Maybe the Vikings are the one exception in the former category, but the Saints are a team that I don't look at with a great future. Maybe it's because of the stars of the past, maybe getting caught by Father Time. They've really had 4 that are still standing from the great Drew Brees teams that just couldn't find a way to finish the job. On offense, obviously I look at Alvin Kamara and Michael Thomas. For Kamara, he kind of got slowed a little bit by injuries this year, but still had a pretty decent one in terms of running the football. He ran for basically 700 yards, a little short of that. He had 5 scores, but was still also the productive player out of the backfield that he's always been. He added almost 500 yards there and an extra touchdown. So a little over 1,000 yards. Not terrible. It's just not the usual Alvin Kamara that we've been accustomed to over the years, where you would argue that he could be an Offensive Player of the Year candidate. Then there's Michael Thomas, who has basically the last 3 years been dealing with injuries all over the place after he was an incredible receiver and with the Offensive Player of the Year award and looked like he was one of the 2 or 3 best receivers in the game because of the route running in the hands. This year, he did play 10 games, and he was still the 4th most productive receiver for the Saints in terms of yardage, 448 of them. He did score once, which is, again, not what Michael Thomas used to be. Is it time for either of those guys to not be Saints? The word is Michael Thomas won't be for much longer. And then I look at the defense, and I look at the 2, faces of that crew in Cameron Jordan and Marshall Lattimore, who were both outstanding for many years in New Orleans. In the case of Jordan, you're usually used to seeing him get 9 or 10 sacks a year, and it's easy work for Cameron Jordan. Somehow this year, he only got 2, and he played all 17 games. That's really surprising. I don't know what you do with Cam Jordan. I would like to think that he's going to bounce back and have another good year, but last year was a little concerning for me here. And then there's Marshall Lattimore, where Cam Jordan had 2 sacks, Lattimore only had 1 NO, and Lattimore only played 10 games, which is also concerning. The word is that he won't last much longer for the Saints either. I'll get to their cap room later, and over the years, no team has been better at kicking the can down the road than those guys in New Orleans. Let's talk about the new guys. Let's talk about the kind of younger dudes who've taken over the mantle of the cornerstones going forward of this team. Let's talk about Chris Olave, who has been a very good fixture as a wide receiver. He's got 1,100 yards and 5 touchdowns, and he was equal in this regard, the touchdown part, by Rashid Shaheed, who's become a pretty good deep ball threat. He had 5 touchdowns as well and 720 yards. 719 to be official. It feels like those 2 guys are a good 1-2 punch at receiver going forward. Well, that is if the latter will be staying in New Orleans. More on that later. The receiving core aside from those 2 is led by Kamara and Thomas, which is a little concerning that no one else has really taken up the mantle aside from those 2 as the guys that could be good pass catchers. Running the ball, Kamara still led the team with that, and second on the team was Taysom Hill, because of course it was. And Taysom Hill is another guy, I guess you could say, is a name from the last couple of Drew Brees teams And the Swiss Army knife did a little bit of everything, like he usually does. He threw a touchdown pass. He ran for 4 scores. He caught a couple scores. He caught 2 of them there. So a bit of a fantasy football dream, and a guy who does a bit of everything and can't seem to be super great at any one thing. Because of course that is. The 4 rushing touchdowns is second on the team, by the way. And then there's the usual starter at quarterback. There's Derek Carr, who got beaten up because that's kind of what happens to Derek Carr. And it runs in the Carr family that you get sacked a lot over the weeks and over the years. He got sacked 31 times, which for the Saints, not terrible, but it felt like he got beat up in a few games. Anyway, Carr did throw for 3,800 yards, and the Saints actually had a borderline top 10 passing attack when you put everything together. It didn't look as great as it probably should have, because there were times where the Saints offense stalled and settled for 3 way too much. But when the offense got rolling and got some big plays downfield to Shaheed or Olave, they were able to get into the end zone quite a bit. Or those little dump offs to Kamara that Alvin Kamara could still get busy on. There was also that. I would argue that the defensive face is now Demario Davis, who over the last few years has been incredible in terms of getting tackles and is still criminally underrated in some circles. He had 121 tackles this past year. He also had 6.5 sacks, which was second on the team. He was really, really good this past year and continues to have incredible work and production. Leading the team in sacks was Carl Granderson. He had 8.5. He played all 17 games, and maybe he's the guy that's going to take over as the lead pass rusher for New Orleans when Cam Jordan decides to bow out. Although I did like Brian Brise, who had a good rookie year, 4.5 sacks in his part from the defensive tackle spot. Maybe he could get to 6 or 7 in the next year and continue his progression. But I like what I'm seeing so far from Brise. Can New Orleans get more production in terms of taking the ball from people? The Saints had 2 guys with 4 NOs. Austin Adebo and Tyrann Mathieu both had 4 apiece to lead the team. The latter just got a brand new deal, and the former just also added 2 fumble recoveries and 2 forced fumbles to his 2023 totals. Decent work on both parts. So, if what you just heard feels like the Saints have a lot of old and veteran players on the team, you'd be correct. The Saints are the oldest team in the league. They're at 27.4 years of age on average. They're the oldest team in the league. If it makes you feel better, New Orleans, the second oldest team is Carolina. They are a little over 27 years of age as well. And as we saw with the Panthers, it's not great. Anyway, the Saints cap situation, as I've mentioned a few times, is also something that's incredibly interesting because they are masters at kicking the can down the road and mortgaging the future for the present. But we can get to that in a minute. What we are going to get to right now is their free agency. They really don't have too many that's of crazy note. I mean, Andreas Pete's a good offensive lineman. Trey Turner's not bad. As I mentioned before, the Saints are able to protect the QB at a decent clip, so that's not a terrible thing. Zach Bond, who's never seemed to really find the flow and a rhythm, he is a free agent as well. And the main big free agents I think to really pay somewhat of attention to is Shaheed, who, as I mentioned, has proven himself to be a good home run hitter when given the opportunity. He's a good deep ball threat. Kind of a maybe poor man's Gabe Davis in terms of the hype and the buzz he may get. I think that's the first person I think of when I would compare him. I think there's a spot for Shaheed in the NFL to me. Will that spot still be in New Orleans? And if it is, how does New Orleans possibly pay for it? For years, New Orleans has tried to mortgage the future and put more money on the credit card, and it never really worked with Drew Brees in terms of getting them to another title. Much fun was had in the NFC South because they all seem to hate each other. And even since then, they've only been mediocre and have refused to bottom out and refused to just blow it up and then reset the cap situations and try to reset for the future. They don't seem to be really keen on doing such a thing. So instead, they kick the can down the road. And where the Saints are right now is 29th in the league in terms of their cap. They're a little under $9 million over the cap. So naturally, before Wednesday, they're going to have to do a little bit more maneuvering. But considering how New Orleans has been able to balance their books for years now, I get the sense that they're going to balance their books pretty quickly and efficiently, and then maybe do something in free agency to keep things afloat in a division that I would argue is kind of sort of winnable. Their draft picks are as follows. They've got some compensatory picks today, and they actually just dropped earlier today. They have their first round pick at 14th overall. So the Saints, in theory, maybe get a little younger, maybe get some help on the offensive line to bookend Trevor Penning, who has had some injuries. I think he's a pretty good tackle, but obviously they can use that left tackle of the future in his case. They have the second round pick from the Broncos, thanks to the Sean Payton trade. They don't have a pick after that until round 5. They give up their own second round pick to the Eagles, as I mentioned in the Olave trade before. I may have mentioned that beforehand. They don't have another pick till round 5, and in round 5, they've got 3 comp picks, and then they have their own pick at 149, and then they have 2 picks in round 6, one of them coming from the Eagles, again, the Olave deal, and then they have Denver's round 7 pick also coming from the Sean Payton deal. So New Orleans is in a bit of a rough spot. They are an aging roster, and they also don't seem to have enough tools to truly rebuild like they want to. Not to mention the fact that cap room is pretty awful for a squad in their position. At least they're not the Panthers, I guess. Even with the amount of draft picks, it's still not great. Some of you may be familiar with the phrase, do unto others as they may do unto you. As we go to Duval and talk about the Jaguars, that's kind of what happened with them. They were the benefactors of a massive collapse by the Titans, who had a golden opportunity at the 1 seed with about a month and a half to go. They ended up missing the playoffs after losing 7 straight. 2 of those losses were to the Jaguars. The first one was a beatdown in Nashville that caught everyone by surprise. The second one culminated with a strip sack by Rayshon Jenkins, who had 2 monster plays down the stretch in 2022, and a scoop score by Josh Allen that helped end Tennessee's season and send them to their vacation in Nashville. Following week, the Chargers chargered and blew a 27-0 lead because of course they did. And Jacksonville ended with a divisional round loss to the Chiefs. There was no shame in that at all. Then this past season starts and Jacksonville picked up from where they left off. The guys who played well, Christian Kirk and Trevor Lawrence and Travis Etienne, Josh Allen, Rayshon Jenkins and company, they all played well until December 4th. On that day, the Jaguars were 8-4 and had control of the 1 seed. All they had to do was win out, and the road of the AFC goes through Duval County. And then Jacksonville self-destructed. The first drive of that night, it ended up being the last of which from Christian Kirk as we knew him. Christian Kirk got hurt in this particular game, and we really didn't see too much of him since then. Trevor Lawrence also got hurt towards the end of said game, and he was never the same either. From then, the Jaguars lost this game to Jake Browning and the Bengals, more on Cincinnati on the next set of videos, and Cincinnati and Jacksonville never really got back on track. The next week, they lost to another Ohio team that wears orange, but this one was in Cleveland. Lawrence was awful. They got dominated by the Ravens with some really bad clock management sprinkled in there, and got absolutely destroyed by Tampa Bay. It was 30-12, but it was never that close. Tampa Bay could have beaten them by 50 if they were competent enough. Tampa Bay was a pretty good team. They got a free win against the Panthers because, of course, they did against their brother, and then they got humiliated, ironically, by the Titans to close out their season and close down their playoff chances. Jacksonville had control of the AFC South until that Titans game, and then they self-destructed and lost that Titans game. They went from 8-4 to 9-8 and out of the playoffs. A really bad December, the worst December in the NFL. And it's a shame, too, because Trevor Lawrence, until that Bengals game, was actually playing pretty well. He did end up with 4,000 yards, but I think we all look at Trevor Lawrence like, are you really that guy? You had a great second half of 22 and a pretty good first half, or 3/4, I guess, of 23. But everything else has either been Urban Meyered or it's been pretty below standard, or at least below the standards that you were alleged to have reached. Travis Etienne has proven to be a pretty good running back. He had another 1,000-yard season. He also had 11 scores, and ETN out of the backfield is still as productive as we kind of sort of expected him to be. He's a good player. He had another 476 yards and a touchdown receiving. Good player. And he and Trevor Lawrence, the Clemson boys, are going to have their fifth-year options decided upon. May 2nd is the deadline for such a thing. Calvin Ridley, after the suspension for gambling, turned out to be kind of sort of back. 1,000-yard season on his part, receiving, and 8 scores to pace the team. Good work on his part. I like what he's doing, but Jacksonville might not like it enough to keep him. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Christian Kirk, until he got hurt, was easily on his way to another 1,000-yard season. 787 yards. I do want to see him get in the end zone more than 3 times, but I think the only reason why he didn't is because he got hurt in the Bengal game and was never the same guy, or back for that matter. Evan Ingram has proven himself to A, have hands, and B, be productive. He almost had 1,000 yards this year. He was 37 yards short, and he had 4 scores to be second on the team. Ingram has proven himself to be a reliable tight end, and to be honest, the longer Jacksonville keeps him, the better off they'll be. I like what I'm seeing there. Defense, I did need to see a couple things. I needed to see Josh Allen take that next step into high-tier pass rusher. I needed to see Trayvon Walker take the next step into proving that you're worthy of the first overall pick that you were bestowed. I got both. Trayvon Walker had 10 sacks. Very good second year. I like what I saw there. Great work. But Josh Allen paced the team with 17 and a half and was among the league leaders in such a thing. Great work on his part. Is absolutely becoming one of the best pass rushers in the game, like he was billed to be. And continuing to make the Giants regret not taking him over Daniel Jones. Good work by Jacksonville in that regard. Good work there. As for your tackles leader, Forsaid Oluokun continues to do that. He's one of the best tackling linebackers in the game, one of the best tacklers in the game, period. And he added 173 more to his gaudy totals over the last few years. One of the top 5 tacklers in the business. Yet, Devin Lloyd, who also played really well, and he had 123 tackles on his part. So the former first-round pick continued to be productive. 127 tackles, I should say. A player that I really like is Rayshawn Jenkins. And he had another good season, over 100 tackles. And he was a guy that seemed to make big plays in 2022. One of which, the strip sack that led to the game-winning touchdown I mentioned before that won them the AFC South. And, of course, the pick 6 against Dak that beat the Cowboys. He won't be back as a Jaguar. They decided to release him, and I don't know if he's going to get big money in free agency because it's a really deep free agency safety class, but I think Jenkins is going to have a job, and I think he's going to continue to make monster plays once he gets there. Josh Allen finished 4th in the team with 66 tackles. After him was Andre Sisco, who, though he finished 5th with 62 tackles, he also got 4 NOs. Darius Williams for the team lead in that particular category. Jacksonville could obviously stand to improve on taking the ball away, but they could also stand on trying to keep it. Trevor Lawrence was among the league leaders in NOs thrown. He had 14 of them, which put him tied for 4th. Now, yes, he was tied with Tua and Pat Mahomes in that regard, but I think Jacksonville got burned defensively because of the short fields that his NOs provided. Jacksonville does improve on the turnovers. I do think their defense won't get cooked as much as they did down the stretch in the 2022 season. Jacksonville's already made some decisions when it comes to the 2024 team. First, Rayshawn Jenkins was let go, as I just mentioned, and he will be a free agent in the next couple of days. Well, technically, he could sign with another team right now since they've released him, but he will absolutely be a free agent without any sort of tampering issues, even though tampering period starts in a couple days. Calvin Ridley will probably not be back, and he'll have to wait till Monday for the tampering period to begin, but he will more than likely not be back. And I think for Jacksonville not to really feel his loss, it's going to be up to Christian Kirk to be healthy like he was for the first year and change that he's been in Duval. Ridley's 1,000-yard season was impressive, considering he basically didn't play for a year and a half. But the real question will be for him, where does he go and how does he fit with his new team? Talked briefly about Darius Williams, who had 4 NOs to tie Andre Sisco for the team lead. He too is a free agent and can pursue work elsewhere. I think he'd be a pretty quality depth signing, and I think would benefit from not having to be the top corner or maybe even the second best corner on a particular team. So that's another interesting free agent to look out for, leaving potentially Jacksonville, and Duval County. The Jaguars' cap situation isn't awful, but decisions on whether Trevor Lawrence and or Travis Etienne getting fifth-year options will have to be thought about. The Jaguars are 21st in the league as of now with their cap room at about $17.3 million. So they can afford to make some smaller depth signings as of now, forward structures, and we'll see if Trevor Lawrence and or Travis Etienne, one would think Etienne won't, but Lawrence will, get the fifth-year option to make things a little bit more affordable for the Jaguars in the 24 year. The draft pick situation, also not terrible. They will pick 17th, and I guess the question would be, would they dare go defense and try to get a top-flight corner? And you might need one, considering the other three quarterbacks in this division, if Will Levis develops. Or maybe perhaps they try to replace Ridley in a really good wide receiver draft and see if they can get another top-level receiver to play alongside Christian Kirk on a rookie deal. Their other picks, they don't have a second, but they do have a third-rounder, which is a compensatory pick. They have 2 round 4 picks, one of them ironically from the Saints. They have round 5 pick of their own. They have a round 6 pick of their own, a round 6 pick that's a compensatory pick, and a round 7. So Jacksonville does have a decent amount of resources, I would say, to try to build their roster up and gear up for what will be a really interesting AFC South division to deal with in the next season. And with that, you have now reached the final stop on my train of thought. The next train will be the final one, featuring non-playoff teams. First, we're going to start in Seattle, where the Seahawks, I would say, had a kind of disappointing and maybe deflating season with Geno Smith and company. Then the train will go from the Pacific Northwest back to the Midwest, and it's going to head to Cincinnati, where the Bengals will look to try to reclaim their spot as the king of the AFC North jungle. They might want to figure out how to win more consistently when it comes to their divisional games first. So that's Seattle and Cincinnati, and both teams are going to have to answer the question, where do they go from here?